Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the 1994 film The Mask. Really, I think some people would have have heard of this movie at some point. Some people might not have known some other things about it. Recently, some people might not have known that the Mask movie had an animated series that went along with this movie. I had caught the animated series and watched some episodes here and there during its first iteration. Eventually, I'm trying to figure out how I can re-find it and re-watch it again. I know it's on like Amazon right now. But I'm trying to figure out like a free way to be able to rewatch that again and enjoy it for what it otherwise provides. I also realized that The Mask had been a comic book before it was even a film. Really, we end up finding out that The Mask in the comic books was actually a much more rated R, grittier revenge story, which, in all honesty, once actually hearing about the story, I was like, man, I would love to get that version of The Mask and get a more darker, grittier story than what we ended up getting here. Like, we end up having it to where also I think that this movie, in all actuality, you have Jim Carrey just selling us this movie like nobody's business. Like, we have Jim Carrey that is just amazing in this movie. But here's the thing. In this film, we have Jim Carrey who is just like working like crazy. But here's the thing that I also would say about this film. We get Stanley Ipkiss a lot. We get Jim Carrey being Jim Carrey as the Mask a lot. We get it to where he's like does these jokes, all of these things, whichever. Bingo hauling, making everybody dance the Congo, and so on and so forth. But we don't actually see a lot of the Mask abilities really all that often. A lot of the stuff is really just kind of waved away by a tornado of sorts or a camera angle or something along those lines, where we have it to where a lot of this stuff is just really just done to just say like, well, yeah, we didn't really have much of a live action budget, so we had to do this kind of thing. And so I thought that I'm like, well, I wish that we would have gone into the much more comic book route and have it be that this is just a revenge movie where we take the entire movie to have Stanley just getting revenge on people that has wrong done him in his life. To where like there's some guy that stubs Stanley's toe, and so when Stanley puts on the mask goes after that man that has stubbed Stanley's toe and just really break his hand or break his finger or break his toe or break his foot or so on and so forth. Like to where this guy will never step on another person's toe ever again, and so on and so forth. Like, I would have liked there to have been like a entire revenge movie where where Stanley had just been a person that had been like taking it for so long that eventually he gets to just be like, oh, okay, well now like I'm not like going to take it when I become the Mask. Uh, like we could have had it to where at some point, like Stan Lee could have came into work one day because he was really late, and he could have been fired, and then so the Mask really could have went and gone after his boss and tried to find out that this guy is doing some criminal activity, and then got his boss arrested, and then because really we eventually have it to where like Stanley Ipkiss eventually gets like a ton of money, and so really we eventually have it to where like Stanley doesn't really do anything with that. He just like keeps going on to have his normal day-to-day life. It's not like life bizarrely gets better for Stanley, or that he like once he does start to become the Mask, he starts to become more confident, or even much more like the Mask every time that he puts it on. But we end up having it to where the mask doesn't really do anything that feels like out of the ordinary, or what, like there seems to be a formula with this character, and we end up having it to where consistently we have the Mask kind of being much more of like the Incredible Hulk, like where in the Incredible Hulk movie we end up having Bruce towards the tail end of that movie saying like, well, maybe I can just like aim the Hulk at whatever the villain is of this movie, and I can't help but look at the Mask and say like the Mask is kind of like the same thing. Like there is not really and truly like 100% a point where the Mask isn't just to be legitimately just be aimed at something, uh, and that's like the most kind of like, wow, what a coincidence that that Stanley is kind of forced to eventually just be this superhero because this story needs him to be. Not him just being an anarchist or a person that is just wreaking havoc, because it's taking off the influence of an otherwise person that is not having the best life, or not having the luxuries of life and whatever, and he's just kind of scraping at the bottom of the barrel. And so where was I trying to get here? We don't have it to where the Mask makes Stanley's life like 100% of a turnaround. We end up having it to where Stanley's life, especially even towards the end of this movie, not much of a difference. And then eventually when Stanley does what he ends up doing towards the end of this film, I just kind of go like, well, wait a minute. Like, this guy's life isn't like 100% complete. If anything, like we have it to where like, what if some repercussions of people finding out who the Mask actually is, like, this could continue on, and then Stanley's just like, well, I don't have the Mask, so I guess I need to just be killed. Like, I guess I'll just be killed because I don't have the Mask. What if somebody was to go asking for the Mask? It seems that eventually, once Stan Lee eventually does what he does with the Mask, like, we eventually have it to where it seems that there are potential people that are, I think, honestly, Stanley could have honestly sold this Mask off to the highest bidder and made $1 million, and his life could have been increasingly better off. But then again, They don't do that in this story. We could have ended up having it to where, yeah, Stanley could have sold this off and then could have followed the guy from whoever had the mask, and then eventually he could have killed them off and then could have retaken the mask. Any number of things could have happened within the story. But anyways, so I would say that this movie, like, does a lot of creative things. Like, it gives us a cartoonish like character that I think is performed amazingly well within this movie, within the confines of this movie, and with the limitations of special effects, probably for this time. But if we were to do this today, would this movie be even crazier? Would it be much more interesting? Would it be like, oh my god, like this movie is way better than the original because there's so much they can do now. Ba 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 ba. But it would all just really depend on like, well, are they gonna have the budget for this movie? Are they gonna have a budget for a mask film? I don't know. I don't think they would have like Avengers money for this kind of movie, and that's where I'd just be kind of like, if they rebooted it, would it be done with the best intentions, or would it just be done to just get another thing of this out there, and it wouldn't be done the best way? I honestly think if they would honestly do a straight to comic book adaptation of this mask thing, I honestly think people would be like, whoa, this would be like mind boggling for anybody. Just like, yeah, like I want this. Like if Netflix bought the rights to the mask comic book and then just did a like a rated R release on it, people would be like, oh my god, this is amazing, because like Amazon or like Netflix has like a crap ton of money, so why not have them? Why not have either one of them decided to do this? Like the like Amazon is currently doing Invincible right now, that is very much rated R and kind of really interesting. And if you guys haven't checked that out, definitely do so. So with that said, let's go into spoilers about this movie, because I think I've talked about it in a cryptic like sense enough. And I think that any number of people have probably seen this movie or know what I'm going to say through any portion of this. So for a lot of people, this is probably not their first time ever hearing or seeing a review of this movie. So let's go out of our way to say, well, in final notion of this movie, it's like Jim Carrey is selling the crap out of this movie, and that's the best part of it. There's a lot of things that probably would never work again that work in this movie, like swing music and a dance number, or seemingly dance numbers in this movie. I would say that this movie works for this time, and it works just overall it works. But I think that there is also something that could come out that could have been so much better, so much more interesting, and I honestly think The Mask is probably way better off to have been done as a show rather than a movie, to be brutally honest. Because I think you need a weekly thing of The Mask where you end up having it to where you don't have to rely on a tornado effect that is just going to complete some scene for you. Like, I really think that we need to have and take the time having The Mask, having some interesting like attack moves and stuff like that that would make a story much more interesting. And so that's all I wanted to say for this cryptic like version. Let's get into spoilers about this movie. Let's bust it out. I would say that, like, yeah, like, it's a good solid movie. I just think that there could be a there there could have been a better movie. There could have been a better film. Uh, Special effects only get you so far. Uh, but even that, there's a lot of quick things going on within this movie that I think um, there were some parts of this movie that I think uh, were great, but were done far too quickly, and I think there were some scenes that took way too long to marinate on that were just like Jim Carrey just giving a performance. And so we didn't see nearly enough of uh, the real true mask. We just saw Jim Carrey wearing a green mask. Really and honestly and truly. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we end up having in the very beginning of this film, we end up having Stanley Ipkiss, who is working at a bank. Coincidentally, if people were to ever see the movie Yes Man, I'm like, okay, so wait a minute. So Stanley Ipkiss in the movie The Mask is a guy that works at a bank. Jim Carrey in the movie Yes Man is a guy that works at a bank. Like, I'm kind of curious if like Jim Carrey is just gonna keep doing roles where he's some guy at a bank because he's done it twice now, or maybe it's just a coincidence, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Stanley Ipkiss is a guy that works at a bank. We end up finding Cameron Diaz's character, Tina, who makes her way to this bank to try and open up an account, and Stanley is just the right guy at the right time to hear this woman out. While we are having this talk between Tina and Stanley about Tina opening up an account, what is really actually happening is Tina is having a camera in her purse to do a kind of a looky-loo situation to have the some guys see like kind of how this bank vault is set up, so eventually they can sneak and rob into this bank vault. So we eventually have it to where Tina otherwise decides to maybe second guess about having a bank account with this bank today, and then so she ends up walking off. So we go on to have Stanley's best friend mentioning Charlie, mentioning that's like, well, hey, like, I know it will turn that frown upside down. How about we go to the Coco Bongo? And bizarrely, it seems that this club, this Coco Bongo thing, is like the easiest thing to get into. I don't know how many repetitious times that seemingly Charlie or Stanley would be able to get into this club, but they seem to just easily get into it. Or eventually we have it to where when the mask eventually shows up at this club, eventually he uh, ends up bringing in the money to be bribing this club guy to where he'll go into this club. So we have it to where Stanley is preparing to get to the Coco Bongo, and so we end up having him going to a car repair place because he brought in his car for an oil change, and they said, yeah, there's a million things wrong with your car, and so it's going to basically cost $1 million. Basically, like, these are two repairmen of or mechanics that are trying to rob uh, people from everything, like basically trying to swindle people because they don't know any better, to break things on people's cars so that eventually they'll need to come back, or that there's another problem that's more expensive to their car, so on, so forth. And so we have Stanley eventually realizing that these guys are trying to rip him off. And so there's nothing that he can do about it now. So we eventually have it to where Stanley has to rent a car from these people, and it's basically the worst possible car humanly imaginable. Like, Stanley is making it to the Coco Bongo there on fumes and so on and so forth. So eventually, when Stanley makes it to the Coco Bongo, he can, of course, make it through the line, and he ends up getting splashed with something for his troubles. And then eventually we end up having Tina end up coming out of the Coco Bongo, like, "Oh, hey, you're making into the Coco Bongo there, Stanley?" And he's like, "Yeah, I made it in there, but yeah, I'm gonna just try to leave for the night." And so we end up having Stanley giving us Stanley ends up going and having a valet go out and retrieve his car, and so the valet comes back with his horrible car, and he says, "Okay, here's your car, sir." And Stanley goes, "No, this is not my car. It's like, if anything, I was driving a Porsche, and this isn't my right car, but I guess I'll take it anyways." And so we end up having Stanley just driving off with this car that is just on its last leg. And so we end up having Stanley just kind of at the end of his rope, just kind of really thinking that eventually he's going to go off this side of a bridge and then just jump off. But instead, he ends up going and seeing uh, a thing in this water, and so he ends up uh, tracking down what this thing is. He thinks that it's a person that is drowning in the water, but instead, we end up having it to where Stanley realizes that it's just a bunch of trash all bizarrely collected together to make it look like a human person. And eventually, we end up having it uh, to where Stanley is trying to figure out, like, where was the face part of this thing, and eventually he ends up finding out that it's a mask. We end up having the police kind of dropping by and saying, like, "Well, hey, sir, like, what are you doing in that water there?" And we end up having Stanley's like, "Well, I was trying to find my mask." And so we have it to where Stanley is going into his apartment to play cartoons and play with his dog, and we have a really annoying neighbor that, like, no little tiny bit of sound could come out of this apartment room, or she's gonna have a grievance about it. Uh, we eventually have it to where like Stanley comes from out of the water and into this apartment building, and we end up having this noisy neighbor who is his, of course, landlord, saying, like, "Oh my God, you're bringing in water into this apartment building? Like, that's gonna come out of your security deposit." So we have Stanley going, like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, like, what else worse could happen?" And so we end up having it to where Stanley goes into his room and then eventually just decides, like, "Well, you know what? How about I just, like, play with this mask? Like, just put it on, see what happens." So eventually Stanley puts on the mask at first and he ends up getting almost like sucked into the mask. And he's like, "What the heck?" And so he ends up looking at it again, and it like it shimmers and it shines or whatever bizarrely inside of this mask, and to eventually we end up having it to where consistently Stanley is just uh like there's something about him putting on this mask. If it was kind of weird before, like he's just like, well, no, like now I have to put this on. I don't know why, but I just have to put this on. So Stanley tosses this thing on, and he ends up tornadoing around in his apartment. And he's like, well, hey, um, I'm gonna put on this nice like we end up having a mask tornado into showing like, oh, okay, this is a different mask. And so we end up having the mask getting ready for his night, shaving and all kinds of bizarre things, even though he has no hair on his entire head. So we eventually have the mask realize, like, well, you can't make the scene if you don't have the green. And so we end up having the mask going uh, and going out of his apartment to then realize that he's like, oh yeah, like I should get back at my neighbor. And so we end up having the mask trying to tiptoe out of his apartment building, but then he ends up dropping things that make an enormous amount of noise. We end up having an alarm clock going off. We end up having the mask coming in with like a gag, like a giant, like a sledgehammer or whatever of sorts, and just like he ends up trying to smash the alarm clock. His neighbor is to check to see what the heck this noise is, and we end up having the mask, of course, giving her like the bizarrish, like alienistic, googly eyed, whatever things to scare the crap out of her. And then she goes and gets her shotgun and fires upon the mask, and then he just like bounces up and down the apartment building, and then eventually crashes outside of the window or smashes through the window to escape. Eventually, a police officer is to eventually be at the apartment to fill out a report. Stan Lee is to hear about said report and uh, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where Stanley goes on to uh, rob the bank that was otherwise in the progress of being robbed. We end up having Dorian and his bag of thugs or gang of thugs all going and trying to steal from this bank vault, and the mask goes in and easily steals everything, and then runs off, as well as the mask going after these mechanics and have a muffler like tied around them and just to where eventually I guess he ends up getting his revenge. So going on, we end up having the mask having a ton of money, and so he ends up going out to the Coco Bongo. He ends up bribing his way into the club, and then he ends up going into the club to see Tina doing her performance, and so we have a tour. The mask, of course, instantly is falling in love with this girl, to where eventually he ends up snapping his fingers to have a whole entire dance number performance done with both him and Tina. Towards the tail end of that performance, we end up having Tina and the mask kissing, to where eventually that leads to gunfire to just be like, well, hey, man, uh, like this mask guy, he's gonna be dead. Because eventually we end up having the Dorian thugs making their way back to the club to mention that they had failed at getting the money, and they ended up getting shot in the process. Which is to have one of the thugs finger that, hey, it was this guy, it was the mask guy, and so go after him, shoot him down, and so on and so forth. So we have it to where there is uh, a shot that ends up going off, which ends up leaving a piece of Stanley's pajamas onto the Coco Bongo, and to where the mask ends up running off to eventually go and fight more crime. It seems that at some point we end up having a bunch of motorcyclists looking gang characters that the mask has to eventually take care of and make balloon animals for. And then eventually he ends up making a Tommy gun. And then he ends up like firing in the air to where they all run off. And he's like, you know what? Like, I think I could easily be a superhero. And so we end up having it to where uh, now that Stanley is going to be home and taking off the mask and whatever, we eventually have it to where Stanley is becoming more of the mask every single day. Uh, like it seems that Stanley and the mask are almost becoming one and the same. Uh, if anything, like we have it to where Stanley is just like, well, it seems like this mask character has been able to kind of unlock something from Stanley to where he's much more confident, or when he's consistently late at at his job, we eventually have it to where Stanley like really rips um, his boss a new one just to say like, hey man, like I know about the illegal stuff that you're doing, so don't let me go and call the feds on you, and so on and so forth, to let them know how much you're stealing from daddy or whatever. So we eventually have Tina coming in the next day uh, to talk to Stanley. I don't know why I keep wanting to say like Stan Lee, like the comic book creator Stanley, instead of Stanley. Um, we have Tina coming into the bank to just say, well, hey, we have it to where Tina is kind of interested in just leaving town. It seems that her and Dorian are kind of at a crossroads. We end up having it to where Tina uh, is kind of interested in being able to find wherever the mask is and to be able to talk to him. And so we end up having Stanley going like, well, hey, like I know the mask, like I'm best friends with him, like I was best friends with him in college, so maybe I can get you two together. And so we end up having it to where Stanley goes and is to uh, greet Tina, and before we have Stanley becoming the mask, we end up having this talk between the two of them, which is fairly romantic, about the gas fumes that are in the air and how they make kind of like greens and purples and whatever. And so we have it to where Tina is just kind of sold on much more of Stanley than the mask, but eventually like Stanley is like, well, hey, well, I'll go and find your like mask friend for you. And so we have it to where Tina goes running off after Stanley, to where Stanley is of course going and tossing onto the mask, and the mask is now a French, well, like a very French-ish like character, that he is trying to be romantic, but he's coming on way too strong. To where eventually he's just kind of like, well, like love is like a red wine, and then like we have it to where like this guy isn't exactly whining and dining Tina. Really, we end up having it to where Tina almost hits the mask in the junk for for his troubles, because we end up having it to where the mask goes and like dips Tina, and he's like, yeah, like I will get my croissant, and like we have it to where like the mask is a woman hound, so to speak, and so he thinks that like he has Tina, so he can do like whatever he wants, kind of thing, and to where like really, we have it to where I think Tina just needed the idea of the mask. She didn't actually need the mask, because then she realizes how um, like this character is just too much for her. And so we end up having it to where the police are starting to be aware of the mask, to the point to where we have the Lieutenant Mitch Calloway eventually knocking on the door of Ipkiss and consistently asking about a bank robbery that had happened the night before, and where was Stan Lee during this time. And he had said, like, well, I was sleeping, I was at home, like, blah blah blah. And so eventually we have it to where Mitch Kellaway eventually finds this pajama piece from Stanley, and eventually he ends up saying, like, well, hey, like, I ended up seeing your pajamas uh, in the Coco Bongo, like, and no other person has a pair of pajamas like you. And so, like, what's your story about that? And so we have to where Stanley mentions, it's like, well, somebody stole my pajamas. And we end up having to where the lieutenant is like, really, like, come on, like. And like Stanley's like, well, hey, like, yeah, I don't know what's like happening to where you can't even trust that somebody's not going to steal your pajama drawer. So moving on, so eventually we have it to where the lieutenant and the police force are going and finding uh, the mask at this get together with him and Tina. And so they end up telling him to freeze. We end up having Tina walking away. And then eventually, the mask actually freezes himself in place. And we end up having it to where the lieutenant is like, well, hey, like, uh, now, like, let me cuff you. And we end up having to wear the mask, like, but you told me to freeze. And so, like, well, he said unfreeze. And so then eventually he ends up um, arresting the police officer. Or, wait, so the police officer ends up arresting the mask, and we end up having all this banter about uh, how the mask is like telling him, it's like, oh, you're never going to take me alive. And we end up having it to where the lieutenant is telling police officers to frisk the mask, and they're coming up with like a billion freaking things into his pockets, which make no sense. At some point they end up finding like a bazooka in his pocket, and he's like, I have a permit for that. And so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where eventually the mask easily is able to run away from these police officers, and eventually they end up spotting him yet again. But he otherwise decides, like, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a dance number to where all of a sudden every single cop in town is going to fall prey to this dance number. And all of a sudden, like, these female cops are just going to start singing along with this and dancing along with this. And we're going to do a Congo line and all kinds of things. And we end up having, like, the Lieutenant Calloway, who's just like, God, you people are stupid. Like, why are you dancing along with this character? And we eventually have it to where the lieutenant's partner is like almost getting into the beat of everything. He's almost going to dance along, and we end up having the lieutenant just kind of like, wake out of it, break out of it, come on, like, we need to arrest this schlub. And so we eventually have it to where everybody's just memorized by this whole dancing thing, and the mask ends up skirting away to where eventually he runs off into a dark alley to where he ends up like tossing, like pulling off the mask, and then he ends up running off because no one is going to assess or assume that it's really and truly him. So we have a reporter who is Peggy Brandt, who had talked to Stanley, um, and uh, and Stanley had been reminded about some article that he had sent to Peggy, uh, called "Nice Guys Finish Last," and so Peggy ends up going and retrieving Stanley when he ends up pulling off this mask, and Stanley goes with Peggy to go and have like a hideout. So that way, eventually, uh, Peggy can get the scoop on all this, because reasonably, it seems that the stuff that she was doing before was like ask Peggy. Uh, those things weren't actually paying anything for her, and so eventually she needs money for something. So eventually we get to find out the villain has to have a story in this movie too, and so Dorian eventually is getting to the point of being almost tortured, getting close to be hit with golf clubs and all kinds of things and whatever. Uh, so because it's basically threatening this guy, it's like, give me my money, because his superior is like hounding him, because he's losing out on money, and so it's like, dude, give me my money. And so we have it to where Dorian is pushed to figure out this mask guy, and to uh, put a reward out there for anybody that can uh, find out about this mask guy, who he is, and like, and whatever. And so we end up having Stanley giving his life story to Peggy about this whole mask thing, how it works, and all those kinds of things. And so we end up having Peggy going like, oh, okay, great. Well, like I've just been waiting out here for eventually Dorian to come in here and take this mask from you and then kill you off. Because we end up having Dorian giving Peggy this batch of money, and Peggy ends up going like, well, sayonara, because I've made my payday. And so we end up having Dorian get the mask from Stanley, and so we have it to where Dorian asks Stanley, like, well, hey, like, how does this exactly work? And we have it to where Stanley's like, well, I don't even know. Like, just put it on. And so we have it to where Dorian is, like, slowly but surely putting on the mask. Like, his minions are just like, well, like, be careful, buddy. So Dorian puts on the mask, and he's like this big, huge behemoth masked character. And really, I would say that this mask is kind of like a super soldier serum thing, where it escalates, like it makes like a person, um, like much more of who they actually are. Like it's like the mask actually amplifies a person. So um, if a person's really just down on their luck changes. If if it's a person like Dorian and he craves power, he's going to be even much more powerful, because that's all his main goal is. So we have it to where Dorian is gonna go back to the Coco Bongo to go and kill off his former boss, so he can now establish dominance, that he's like the biggest guy in town, and that eventually he's going to swindle and steal everyone's money, so that way he can like run off after this. I would assess or assume. Uh, and so we also end up having Dorian going and uh, having Stanley and go to prison for being unveiled as this mask character. they basically just give him a fake green mask, and then they toss him out of this car to where the police are going to pick him up and say, oh yeah, he's the masked character, let's book him. And so we end up having the police go and book Stanley. We have it to where Tina is to go and see him, and eventually she is going to go and run off, but eventually Dorian's gang ends up stopping her from running off, and we have it to where Dorian's like, oh man, like, you're running off on me? Like, how could you? Like, I thought we had a good thing going here, but I guess not. So we have it to where Tina ends up being held hostage to eventually be tied to a palm tree, or taped to a palm tree, to have a bomb being placed on her, and at the Coco Bongo. And so kind of set up almost everything. And so we end up having it to where Stanley is to notice that there is a guard falling asleep, and Stanley is desperate to say, like, hey man, there's a woman being hurt in this back alley here. I'm hearing what's going on. We end up having the police officer going like, no, whatever. And it's like, Stanley's like, hey man, protect and serve, man, come on. So the guard ends up going right back to sleep, and so we find out that Milo is in that same dark alley where I guess Tina was, and so we end up having Stanley desperately asking for Milo to jump up onto this window, so Stanley could grab Milo and get him into this prison to be able to get him to be broken out. So we have it to where Stanley is telling Milo to jump up onto the wall to be able to have Stanley grab him, and he does so. Stanley goes and has, of course, the dog try to get the keys, and the dog ends up grabbing the cheese instead. And it's like, no, the keys, grab the keys. And so eventually Milo grabs the keys, and then eventually he is bumping into the lieutenant yet again, to where eventually Stanley ends up grabbing the lieutenant's gun and then saying, like, well, I'm going to get out of here, one thing or another. And so we end up having the lieutenant taking Stanley out of this prison, and while that is going on, behind Stanley's back there is a gun to the lieutenant. And so nobody's really the wiser about whatever the heck is going on with Stanley, and nobody asks questions. And so we end up having it to where the lieutenant's partner is asking, like, well, hey, like, where are you going with Stanley, lieutenant? And so we end up having the lieutenant saying something in Pig Latin, and his partner realizes that, oh, you're saying something in Pig Latin, but he can't decipher what the heck it is. And so we have it to where the lieutenant and to where Stanley go into the lieutenant's car and make their way to the Coco Bongo. We end up having it to where Stanley gives the lieutenant like some kind of radio to just say, like, well, hey, like, call for backup or something. And so Stanley makes his way to the Coco Bongo without the power of the mask, and because of course Dorian has the mask. And so we end up having it to where I'm trying to figure out how to end this movie. We end up having Dorian, who is annihilating all of his bosses and all kinds of things, and so we end up having it to where Tina ends up asking for one last kiss between him and Dorian, or between her and Dorian, and so we end up having Dorian as the mask going and trying to kiss Tina, and Tina's like, no, like, I want the real Dorian, like, I want my Dorian. And so we have Dorian who ends up taking off the mask to uh, to eventually kiss Tina. Tina ends up getting one of her legs out of the tape and ends up kicking the mask. Stanley ends up making it into the club, and so we end up having it to where it's a scramble to get the mask. It seems that Milo is also there, so he tries to get the mask. We have it to where Stanley goes and tries to fight Dorian, which I think was hilarious because we have it to where Stanley like can't throw a punch to save his soul. When seeing Stanley just like punching Dorian, it just looks so odd and so hilarious. And we eventually have it to where when Dorian gets the upper hand on Stanley, we end up having it to where like Stanley mentions is like, well, like I hope you're gonna relish this victory with one good eye, and Dorian's like, what? And then we end up having Stanley like poke Dorian in the eye, and he's like, ah, and then we have it to where Stanley's just like pummeling Dorian, and then eventually he's like, hey, I'm winning, and then like Dorian just punches Stanley, and like it's like this repetitious back and forth. So we have it to where everyone is scrambling for the mask. Dorian's goons, uh, Milo, and so Milo ends up getting the mask, and we end up having it to where Milo ends up turning into this tornado, and we have it to where the one of Dorian's goons is like holding on to Milo, and so once Milo comes out of this tornado, we end up seeing a mask Milo, which I thought was really hilarious. We end up having like Milo like tearing through Dorian's goons' pants and underwear and so on and so forth, biting them viciously and stuff along those lines. And so we eventually have it to where eventually Stanley ends up getting the advantage on Dorian and ends up just kind of like knocking him out. To where eventually Stanley goes to the mask, pulls the mask off Milo, goes and realizes how much time is left on this bomb, and so we end up having the mask now going and devouring the bomb and having it explode into his stomach. And then we end up noticing that Dorian is trying to make it back to Tina and the mask. And so we end up having the mask going and creating a flushing like a flusher pulling thing. And so we end up having the mask hitting this flush button, and we have Dorian just kind of circling this drain, and then he gets consumed. And so eventually we end up having it to where all is right with the world. All the villains are now are done and dead and whatever. There was a really funny moment when Stanley becomes the mask, and then eventually he is to be assumed numerous times over that he is dead at some point or is going to die. Because we end up having to where Stanley ends up trying to retrieve the mask from under some bar table or under some bar. And so we end up having Stanley run for it. He ends up putting it on and then becoming the mask. And then the Dorian gang like shoot up this entire bar. And the mask is like, well, like, did you get me? And then so he takes a drink and then everything is pouring out of him. It's like, I'd like to think so. And so eventually we get it to where the mask is seemingly to be beaten down by this Dorian gang to eventually to where we are to assume that the mask is going to die. So we eventually have it to where the mask ends up going and is saying his oh woes and goodbyes, and that he's like uh like uh tell Scarlet I do give a damn, and so on and so forth. Like, tell Auntie M that I won't be back next Christmas, and so all these kinds of things, and he's like he's like coughing through the whole thing, and so one of these Dorian goons is like holding onto the mask, and he coughs in front of the goon's face, and so on and so forth, and then he ends up supposedly like dying off, but then eventually like someone hands him an Oscar, and he's like, oh my god. He's like, and so he's like, oh yeah, he this is amazing. It's like, you like me, you really like me. And then eventually we have it to where like the Dorian gang like stops all this whole bizarre thing going on to get back to the scene, to get back to action, and so on and so forth. Hilarious moment, but really there's so much about this that's kind of really goofy and hilarious and whatever. And I just want to try to recreate all these scenes and whatever. Like, if anything, there's some kind of hilarious scenes that end up going into the original thing before the whole dance number, where Stanley is uh, being either a dog, or his like heart is completely boo 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 out of his chest. But other than that, like, yeah, there wasn't much that I really wanted to cover within this movie that hasn't been a scene that people have probably seen a million times over. And so, really, when looking at this, I still think that this movie is an enjoyable movie. Like, I would have just wanted something um, better than like, there is so much endless possibilities with this movie that I think we could still do, and I think that is a real important thing, that uh like we could do, like, especially with that animated series, that I think uh really had it to where yeah, like the movie kind of gave us a little sample of this character, but I think the animated series is way much more of a better avenue to go into. And so that's all that I wanted to say about this, and I am going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody. Oops.